welcome back to In Search of Black Power. I'm your co-host, Lawrence Grandpre. So, April 2015, Freddie Gray, young black man, born and raised in the Gilmore Homes projects in West Baltimore, was arrested by police. He was injured in the midst of that arrest. Someone took a cell phone video. That video went viral, put in the back of a police van, came out dead. So, in 2025, we're looking at the 10-year anniversary of the Baltimore Uprising, the series of events started by the Grassroots Uprising from the residents of Gilmore Homes that culminated in protests throughout the city with some property destruction and created the context for police reform in Baltimore and in many ways created the context for LBS and this podcast. In some ways was what put us on the map because we were there when folks in Gilmore Homes were protesting in front of the Western District police stations. We were there leading the protests when folks were down in Camden Yards, the Baltimore Orioles baseball stadium. We were there when some of the protests led to property destructions, and we were there afterwards when Corinne Gaines, a black woman in Baltimore County, was killed and at the memorial at my alma mater. We went to the same high school. We were there when the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights was repealed in 2021. Maryland was the first state to pass it. We were the first state to get rid of it. We were there when the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund, 3% of all tax revenue from property taxes going to a fund explicitly for use, explicitly in the context of the Baltimore Uprising, and explicitly in the context of empowering black grassroots organizations. This is part of what we bring as a benefit to the podcast community, not just a theoretical talking head perspective, but from the perspective of folks doing grassroots, concrete political advocacy, and if I may say so myself, achieving real concrete material victories and progress for our people. So this has been somewhat surprising that a slew of academic texts and articles, and certainly more, will come out in midst of the 10-year anniversary of the Baltimore Uprising, and they're all going to say the same thing. Nothing has changed. They're going to tell historical tales of why the people in Baltimore were duped and misled by black misleadership, seduced by capitalism and patriarchy to not respond to Corinne Gaines the way they did for Freddie Gray, and basically tell a story about Baltimore that says more about them than it tells you about Baltimore. That's not surprising. But the problem is we need the facts to be able to figure out what models of advocacy work and what don't. We need to know the material reality of what's happening on the ground here in Baltimore as and before people project their political pessimism or their political theories onto the material reality of the life which we weren't just living in, but helping to produce. It is somewhat inducing a vertigo to see yourself essentially written out of history in real time, as I feel is happening in some of these texts that we will be reviewing today. So for the 10-year anniversary of the Baltimore Uprising, we will be reviewing Cedric Johnson's text, After Black Lives Matter, and Marcus Board Jr.'s text, Invisible Weapons, both of which use the Baltimore Uprising as central context for their political analysis. One is critical of the so-called Black Lives Matter movement, Cedric Johnson, from a perspective of racial capitalism. The other, Marcus Board, sees itself more as a fellow traveler and supporter of the movement for Black Lives, anti-neoliberal, intersectional feminist approach. And while having contrasting political trajectories, I think they both reflect a level of projection by the Academy onto the reality and complexity of black life and black politics in Baltimore. And given that we have this platform, thanks to Black Liberation Media, which we hope you continue to support, given the work that we do, we thought it was important for us to add our perspective to not really review these texts. Because again, I don't want you to think of these as book reviews. You do not have to have read these books to understand what we're talking about. This is presenting you an understanding of the ideas and trajectories, intellectual and political trajectories being represented in these texts. And us, not just as people with a particular black nationalist and pan-African political perspective, but as literally residents of Baltimore basically our whole lives, and folks on the ground doing the work which people are theorizing about, knowing the people they're theorizing about, bringing you more of an inside scoop and perspective to help you contextualize what you maybe have heard, because these books are already out, or what you will hear as the 10-year anniversary recap articles come out about what is the legacy of the Baltimore Uprising? How do we understand the political trajectories projected onto it? Why is Baltimore, even in the midst of our so-called friends, continuing, as The Wire called it, to be a reservoir reflecting the dark underbelly of the American experiment, even amongst our liberal and progressive and radical friends? So with that, I want to bring you into a conversation between myself, Lawrence Grandpre, and LBS Director of Public Policy, Dayvon, around the 10-year anniversary of the Baltimore Uprising, reflecting on academic and intellectual analysis of Baltimore from the perspective of the Black grassroots. See you on the other side. Dayvon, good to be here with you again in the booth.
Yes, sir. Good to be here.
So, for this podcast, you read Cedric Johnson's book, and I read another book. They both have the uprising as critical facets of the stories they tell.
The Baltimore Uprising.
Yes, of course. And so, with this 10th year anniversary coming up, we wanted to give some commentary about how the Academy is portraying the events there. So, I haven't read this book. I've skimmed the chapter, but I've read Cedric Johnson's previous book about revolutionaries to race leaders, about Black political leadership. So I see this chapter as an extension of his larger argument around sort of the shift in Black political representation, reflecting more of a neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party, and not reflecting the Academy's and leftist perceptions of racial capitalism being the predominant frames to which we should view history, view local politics, and very explicitly in this case view Baltimore and the Baltimore Uprising. But as folks who were there on the ground and have our own conceptions of Baltimore's history and Baltimore's politics, including the literal people he talks about in the chapters, what do you make of the text, and what do you think is happening here with Cedric Johnson as he talks about Baltimore?
So what's interesting to me, I think back to Manning Marable's book on Malcolm X. And one of the things, a lot of people had a variety of different issues and problems they had with it. For me, what was central to my concern with it is that underlying a clear pan-Africanist Black nationalist figure was a political, ideological agenda around undermining the legitimacy of pan-Africanism and Black nationalism, right? So a scholar's perspective transposed on a particular figure or set of events, underneath it is their ideology. And in this case, as you mentioned, Cedric Johnson's book, From Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, I think that there is, and part of what I get from this chapter in this book where he talks about the uprising in Baltimore, is a underlying ideological agenda that describes itself as class-centered and class-focused. But I think one of the impacts of that is that it severely takes on some anti-Black perspectives around really looking substantively at Black civic life. And I think this is a larger problem that the left generally has, where there is not a rigorous, nuanced analysis of Black civic life. Because if there were, then, and as we go through this conversation, I'll identify aspects of Johnson's analysis where what he describes as a class-based analysis that fights back against neoliberalism, that in the Black grassroots, there are efforts that have been successfully won as a result of the uprising, pushing back against this neoliberalism. And so there's a way that the analysis of Cedric Johnson totalizes the forces of neoliberalism amongst Black people in a way that robs a understanding of the agency that Black people have at a grassroots level. And so this is where we get into the politics of revolutionary Pan-African nationalism versus the perspectives that Cedric Johnson has. So we go deeper into that, but that's kind of my general analysis of the impact of how Johnson's analysis describes the limitations of how it describes the nature of Black political and civic life in Baltimore.
Yeah, so I know one thing that stood out to me was he gives a general overview of the poverty programs and community action programs in Baltimore, and he sums it up as basically a space where the most highly educated and technocrats in the black community were able to gain a degree of political access. And he has like one citation for it. And of course, that general oversimplification ignores the story that we tell over and over again about Walter Carter and the community action programs here in Baltimore being more bottom up, more community led, and our work being an extension of the political legacy of that work that, again, oftentimes in these leftist academic conversations gets caricatured as the black elite basically using the suffering of the black masses to gain a degree of access and democratic political patronage within machine politics.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think that, and and building on what you said, the act of base building amongst black people is something that I think is vastly oversimplified. So when we think about, like, how is it that black elected officials occupy the space of being extensions of neoliberal capitalism? Well, a part of that is many of the formations, Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, Republican New Africa, BLA, all these different kind of radical black formations for whom had bases were attacked by the federal government, by COINTELPRO, right? And so many of the individual black people that went into elected politics, and this is a place that Johnson gets right in his book, Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, right, where he says that there was a crop of black people who became elected officials who may have some proximity to some of those black radical formations, but themselves, their politics more liberal, right, than many of those. So that part he actually gets right in his previous book. The problem, though, is that in addition to COINTELPRO attack on those entities that had strong bases of community, I think the other thing is that his analysis in this chapter, this book, of Kwame Ture's Black Power, where to me the core message, one of the core messages in Ture's book, Stokely Carmichael's book, is the importance of building a base of power that emanates from the community. And that many of the black folks that entered into elected politics, in some ways consistent with Johnson's previous analysis, were not folks who had a strong base of political power that emanated from the community, but the basis of their access to those neoliberal centers of power was their proximity to mainstream institutions. So when I read Ture and Black Power, I am thinking about the fact that anyone who thinks that the black elected officials in any way resemble what Ture theorized in Black Power misunderstand the point that he was making. And that, in general, the black masses, I would argue, don't identify many of the black people in public office as representatives of Black Power. And I think, and so in some ways, it's like, so to say it differently, in Baltimore, for the most part, folks aren't confused about the fact that we have a majority black people in elected office, and that does not represent power for black people. I think the most people, that's clear. And the fight to build power within our community to be able to actually practice the kind of power that would be community centered and fight back against neoliberal capitalism, that's something that I think is a constant conversation that is happening amongst our community to fight back against that force amongst some of those networks that overlap with many of the black folks in office. And I would also say that part of the challenge that we also have to keep in mind is that the average voter, so a lot of people are alienated from politics. So most people don't even participate. So a lot of people who are in an office, they're getting elected with a very small percentage of people that are even eligible to vote. And then there are people who decide to vote that's even smaller, right? Or register to vote, and then people who actually vote is even smaller. What people tend to be looking for are electeds who could deliver results for their immediate needs. Like, that is what people are looking for. And unfortunately, because there is not a radical left of any sort that has the infrastructure, whether it's a broader progressive left or whether it's an independent black political left, because there is not a strong institutional political force generally, then the challenge is that when an average person is making a determination, who am I going to support politically? The options that are made available to them are people who represent that neoliberal politics, but are able to deliver for black people. So for me, I see that not as an indictment on the capacity for black people to produce radical politics. I see it as I see it twofold. One is I see it as the absence of the development of the infrastructure and discipline for black radical forces to make themselves able to deliver concretely for the community.
Mm-hmm.
And I see it as the community making a pragmatic decision to say, while we get that this person does not represent radical aspiration for black liberation politics, in this current moment, this person, regardless of their neoliberal agenda, is able to deliver something concrete. And that, I think, what Johnson does is mistakes that for a deficiency in using a radical black nationalist politics as a basis for organizing.
That's very interesting. And I can see some listeners still being a bit confused about how to understand this dilemma, because there seems to be like this general agenda of anti-corporate politics, and that has to be the litmus test for all support. And if you fail that litmus test, then you deserve critique. I think the reality is far more complicated than that. So I'm just looking at the text, and I think there are plenty of examples, but one that comes to mind is the demolition of public housing, and he's rightful to critique that. But I think it's interesting that many of the people, for example, on the east side, who were fighting some of the demolition of affordable housing over there, were tied to things like Sir John Douglas College. And that would be a sort of black nationalist trajectory that could have advocated for community and delivered to them. But many people, including Johnson, would look at formations like that as black nationalist, too capitalist, and not revolutionary. And what we get is advocacy tied to nonprofits and tenants' rights groups and people like that who may do good work but are funded by a white nonprofit industrial complex that doesn't have a space for black community control and is not fundamentally hostile to development, but just is trying to create some guidelines, some criteria whereby development can be kinder and gentler, and in many ways are in bed with the very people they're fighting. And people like Johnson leave the community no alternative but to turn to some of those nonprofit industrial complex institutions as the interracial coalition that we look to. And plenty of people, it's like, I don't think there's no there there, because I've seen those people fail us too many times. But at least someone in community that's trying to deliver materially, be it Sir John Douglas or a community development, a corporation, can do something materially I can touch and control. So do you have any more examples to clarify for people these sort of dynamics?
So a couple of framing things that I think will put the examples in context as well that I probably should have mentioned earlier. One of the limitations of Johnson's analysis is a valorization of the public sector. And in our work, you mentioned the nonprofit industrial complex, our work in criticizing the human social service sector. There are ways in which, not just ways, the human social service sector, the nonprofit sector, perpetuates notions of white supremacy that are embedded in the practices and the kinds of services that get delivered. So whether we're thinking about like child welfare, whether we're thinking about out of school time, even some aspects of reentry where you have in the public sector, even public housing, when you think about the fact that, in principle, it being good, but does it deliver quality housing to the people that live in it? Mm-hmm. Right? And so there are ways that those questions are inconvenient for people for whom the basis of how they describe the solution is quote unquote class-based politics, because then they have to actually confront the way that white supremacy impacts the public sector. And even when we look at like New Deal, right, which is what Johnson kind of valorizes as the best policy prescription to address the issues that working class black people face, we have to look at the fact that many of the benefits of the New Deal did not come to black people, right? And that part of what that the implication is, how do we construct a public sector where black people can practice the kind of sovereignty so that we can deliver the kind of services to our community do not perpetuate the way that white supremacy and the kind of paternalism of it, right, doesn't reproduce notions of white supremacy, doesn't reproduce the kinds of socialization of young people, for instance, where they're severed from their historical understanding of their culture and identity, right? Where, young Black kids become pet projects of nonprofit organizations, where those young people are socialized essentially to beg for interest into the mainstream as opposed to. So I'm giving that as an example of, like, there are real concrete ways that the public sector can be harmful to Black people. And that the only way to push back against that is to build the kind of infrastructure within the public sector that is conscious of that. So this is a place where the analysis missed out. So I say all that because then when we talk about the importance, when we talk about the solutions that Johnson focuses on and talks about, so one of the things he talks about is the One Baltimore initiative that emerged, after the Uprising, and a bunch of multiracial, corporate, neoliberal, market-driven approaches to addressing the issues facing Baltimore. And we were part of those conversations. I know some of the people that are part of those conversations. And we were never unclear that that was the establishment trying to reify its power. Like we were, and I think the general public, the general public wasn't fooled by the One Baltimore initiative. There were a handful of people and a handful of organizations that benefited from it, and that's good that the handful that benefited from it did. But we were clear that that wasn't something that, when we talk about Black people and Black power, we were clear, the broader community was clear that that didn't represent that. What Johnson's analysis misses, though, is some of the work that did emerge from the Black grassroots that has a critique of capitalism, but also grounded in notions of Black self-determination. He would describe as kind of Black nationalist politics or rhetoric, where we were able, as a result, to establish the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund that was able to give more resources to small Black grassroots organizations that work with young people to fight back against a nonprofit industrial complex that funds white corporate nonprofits to essentially control the socialization of Black youth, right? So the Youth Fund emerges, right, as a response to that, right? It's one of the main things. You talk about the Black Church Food Security Network. So one of the things that happens, during the pandemic is a big food shortage. And you have, Black Church Food Security Network that emerges, former Pastor Heber Brown, who runs the Black Church Food Security Network, building a collaboration between Black churches and Black farmers to impact and to develop a food distribution network that Black people control. So that when things like the pandemic happens, we're not having to rely on corporate charity to provide the needs for Black people. But we have the infrastructure to do it independently. Again, this isn't a corporate neoliberal market-based solution. This is something that emerges from the Black grassroots. Heber Brown, who himself is a revolutionary pan-African nationalist, a Black nationalist, but recognizes the importance of not being bought into the corporate neoliberal mainstream, right? And so there are a variety of other examples of efforts that emerged from. One of the things that this doesn't take into consideration, Johnson's analysis, some of the work that happened later on. So there were things that didn't happen right away after the Uprising, but the work of repealing the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights that happened in 2021 after the Uprising, after the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights in Maryland, right? And a variety of other things that have happened since, that much of the work that made those things happen, that happened later on, that pushes back against neoliberalism, was the work, the space of the Uprising opened up. And speaking specifically about LBS, I would argue that the Uprising in many ways made space for us to be able to do a lot of the work to push back against the corporate neoliberalism in ways that even the folks who are more aligned with Johnson's worldview have been less effective at being able to push back against neoliberal capitalism and privatization of public resources. So yeah, all of that to your question to say that the handful of examples that I've given of work that has emerged after the Uprising that made space that I think, but a part of why those examples don't occur to him is because I think folks that tend to have his worldview don't treat Black civic life as a phenomenon to study rigorously that can produce solutions outside of some of the more formalized civic networks that ultimately white people and mainstream people control and operate. And to me, that's a part of even why I wanted to have this discussion. It's because I think the broader left is hampered by its inability to recognize authentically the capacity for Black civic grassroots capability to actually be the solution.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities between this text and the next text we'll talk about. One of the ones that stands out is, they talk about the lawsuit in public housing about people being asked to exchange sex for repairs. We're part of a group that did an entire city hall shutdown around that and many other demands to get the housing commissioner Graziano fired, as well as investment in community. And it's, that was actually tied to people in the networks that would seem to be amenable to his perspective. So it's just something about the fact that things like that don't render to the level of events that are worthy of analysis. I mean, part of it is if it comes from the Black grassroots or it's tied to notions of pan-africanism or Black nationalism, it's not in the space where they would see it. But even when it's not, it's interesting that things like that, because it's only class-based good politics and duplicitous neoliberal politicking of identity. There's very little space for anything in between. Mm-hmm. And these dichotomies are very useful if you're trying to produce an academic analysis that fits within academic conceptions of racial capitalism, but not useful to understand the complexity and nuance of Black life as it actually exists.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the quick thing I'll add, because one of the things that Johnson mentions in this book is an exchange that happened between Jamal Bryant and PFK Boom, and where Boom essentially kicks Jamal Bryant out of a West Wednesdays event. So Tyrone West was killed in 2013 by law enforcement in Northeast Baltimore. His sister Tawanda Jones has been doing West Wednesdays every Wednesday since. And so that was the event. Jamal Bryant shows up. PFK Boom kicks Jamal Bryant out. And Johnson spends significant time talking about that in terms of Black grassroots speaking up against those Black gatekeepers, right? He calls it like Black officialdom. But then he talks about how Boom and Jamal Bryant make up later, a few weeks later, a conversation, a meeting with the Nation of Islam, and he talks about the limits of, Black nationalist rhetoric and Black unity being limited in terms of pushing back against many of these forces. And so I just want to quickly add that using that as an example to analyze Black civic life in Baltimore, I mean, it is so intellectually lazy for that to be the basis of that analysis, because there's so much happening amongst Black grassroots organizations in Baltimore that would be more instructive in terms of what are the primary assumptions and methodologies at play amongst Black folks in the grassroots. And that particular display is not representative of it. It is a spectacle. He acknowledges it's a spectacle, but to use it as a site of analysis, to me, makes your point about the way that it seems that the work of Black civic life is rendered illegible by folks that take on this kind of class-based analysis that Johnson is using.
Yeah, so I just want to say one last thing. I do think this quote is pretty interesting. Briefly, the route to self-determination for working-class Baltimoreans should not follow the logic of racial authenticity, which, as history has shown, can easily be assimilated to neoliberal projects. Examples: minority contracting set-asides, Black excellence charters, urban entrepreneurship incubators, microcredit lending schemes, and so forth. Instead, popular alliances organize against investor class projects for a project of decommodifying social needs, strengthening workers' rights, and rolling back carceral apparatuses are the only viable path to socially just city at this juncture. And the idea that it's just such a clean dichotomy to work with the unions who were against many of our attempts to deal with the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights. That's an internal labor dispute between the police unions and the police chiefs, and many public sector unions who were not police were critical of those efforts because they were afraid of that blowing back on them.
Mm-hmm.
Grassroots parents have questions about teachers' unions because they see the school-to-prison pipeline. They know some teachers just want to get a check and don't mind putting their kids in jail. We just spent millions of dollars putting bulletproof doors on classrooms in Baltimore, in part because the teachers' unions were afraid for their safety. So these are questions that challenge the idea that just work with labor and do interracial politics. And again, even the whole thing about microlending, in Baltimore, that's tied more to like the left, the anti-capitalist left.
Mm-hmm.
Things like Kiva are tied to like things like that would seem to be the people he wants us to work with.
Mm-hmm.
So, and last thing, this whole idea, even having their own arguments could be stronger if they had a deeper understanding of the dynamics actually at play. Because he correctly critiques Under Armour in their attempt to enter into some of the philanthropic world. But the idea of like, you should talk about Under Armour and that ilk donating to living classrooms and trying to control the violence prevention work in a way that ties that to the police and ties that to gentrification agendas. That would actually strengthen your argument, but to do that, he'd have to concede that the most effective community-controlled grassroots version of the work are actually tied to black nationalist, Nation of Islam-affiliated violence prevention organizations. Even in Newark, New Jersey, I talked about it in my webinar, they had a deal for the streets, a ceasefire in the hood, but also a deal for the suites, the corporate leaders of Newark, to actually hire returning citizens and deal with gentrification. And this is an anti-capitalist demand coming from the Nation of Islam affiliated violence prevention organizations. It's just not something he can assimilate in his worldview. And the last thing I'll say is that he actually throws a stray at Naim Akbar in his previous book, talking about how he was at a conference and derailed the conversation with his nationalism. And that shows when you're actually building a base of black people, Naim Akbar's ideas have been central to things like the violence prevention work that has been proven to decrease violence all over this country. So it's not that they've been seduced by illusions of Kemet that led them to support black nationalism. If they see those people doing work in their communities changing lives, and they see you giving sort of simplistic analysis of just support the unions more, just work with the interracial anti-capitalist left more, like we haven't thought about that, and came to a conclusion that we want other stuff too. Like, we'll do it when it makes sense, but the idea that that's the solution is just too simplistic.
Yeah, and let me... couple of things to that too, and one of the things I actually wanted to mention is, one of the folks that we've encountered is a brother named Rashid Aziz, who runs something called the Image Center in West Baltimore, who had a building built to create a center that would manufacture apparel. And his idea being that if you have local manufacturing, you give more jobs to people locally. And his ultimate vision is for the Image Center to be something that the community owns, right? So he's having to navigate many of these neoliberal corporate entities to be able to create the possibility to build this building. And one of the things that has been frustrating is I don't hear leftists clamoring to talk about that. Like, I don't hear leftists saying, oh, here's an opportunity to put into practice a politics where we can build an alternative to neoliberal politics that is actually workable. I mean, again, Brother Rashid Aziz has a building, has the machinery. He struggled and is having to do work to keep it afloat. But to me, that's something that if you're a leftist wanting to build local power against transnational corporations, neoliberal capital, that would be a prime opportunity. But I think it is overlooked by leftists, exactly to your point, because then they would have to concede that because Rashid Aziz, a bunch of the support that he's gotten has been from black folks who have more of a black nationalist perspective, or at least sympathetic. The other thing I also want to say, too, is that the importance of pan-Africanism and black nationalism from an organizing perspective, that many of those class-based entities who talk about the working class actually don't have good relationships with working class black people. So one of the things that I think we see is black nationalists have real, authentic relationships with working class black people. And this ties into the quote you read about black authenticity. Because there's a way that I think we've let white society characterize black authenticity as like black attitudes and aesthetics and behaviors. But what we mean when we talk about like, authenticity, and we don't use that term authenticity, but what that is a stand-in for, rather, is the fact that we see ourselves as accountable to the masses of Black people. And we make it a point to be present in Black civic life such that LBS is only possible because of the deep connections we have within the Black community and things we've been able to deliver results for our community. That should be the basis of the politics that folks engage in. And that many of the unions, for example, that Cedric Johnson is in many ways centering in his analysis of the alternative, what they do best is delivering for the individual narrow interest of the members of their union, which are not necessarily the same as the community that those folks are a part of. So for me, it is our approach, and the approach that I think he's broadly making a caricature of, that is actually more accountable to working class Black people than the alternative that he gives a nod to. And then the other thing I also say is, I think part of the problem, and actually this is something I don't think Johnson is unique in this regard, but even some people who are ideological kin of ours make this mistake, which is many of our people have not been exposed in any systematic fashion to alternative economic models. So sometimes we mistake people's complicity with neoliberalism with an ideological commitment, when in fact, I think particularly for many Black politicians, it's the only thing they know. It is the thing that they've been indoctrinated into. It is the thing they've seen make things happen, right? So if Under Armour comes in and is able to build a community center in a neighborhood, right, we know that the larger political economic forces, that is a net bad thing, right? That we would prefer that Under Armour not be the basis for building stuff in the community. If you're a person who's been indoctrinated by this society, then it will make sense that you think that is a good approach. It will make sense that you might think One Baltimore is a good approach, right? And so I think we have to be, and I think, again, one of the shortcomings of Johnson's analysis is that he makes the assumption that this is an ideological commitment. And so I do think that one of the things that we've been able to do is that in our networks amongst the Black grassroots here in Baltimore, we have been able to put forward a vision of economic development and economic redistribution, whether it's our work on reparations, the stuff we talked about with the youth fund, whether we've talked just about more broad economic redistribution and building infrastructure so that we can actually practice socialism as opposed to just saying, give money to the public sector, let the public sector do it. And I've already talked about the limitations of that. To be able to say, let's build the ecosystem of institutions so that we can practice redistributive economics in a way that the community has control over. And we've written and talked about the importance of developing notions of community control and what that governance looks like, which is hard and complicated, right? But isn't addressed in his analysis at all. So all of that to say that a lot of folks in our community, they've only seen the neoliberal economic model. That's the thing that they've been told over and over again, and that's the thing that they've seen. So a part of the work to be done is to provide those alternatives, and I think Rashid Aziz in the Image Center is one example that if Johnson and broader members of his segment of the left, if they were serious, they would invest heavily in figuring out how to lift up those models as examples of what it means to fight back against neoliberal capitalism. And so in light of all that analysis, so, that was, the Johnson book that I read. And Lawrence, I know you sent me a book that you wanted to talk about that actually has somewhat a similar perspective. I think with Johnson, in the book that I'm referring to, he's actually critical of Movement for Black Lives, right? So that's one way that they kind of differ.
Yes.
Whereas the book you read, the author identifies himself as a comrade of Movement for Black Lives. So I'm interested to hear how some of the critique of Johnson's book and the politics that he brings to it, how that's reflective or overlaps with what you got from the book that you are about to talk about, and maybe some of the differences.
Yeah. So the book is Invisible Weapons by Marcus Board Jr. And along the lines of what you just said, the idea that this is the only thing people know talking about lawmakers and the so-called neoliberal approaches, I think Board sees that as in the masses, that the masses desire a more radical politics articulated through Movement for Black Lives, he almost is trying to basically explain why movement for Black lives has not been more successful, it seems like. And the mechanism he uses to explain it is this idea of an invisible weapons framework where people have internalized the conceptual limits of neoliberalism. And they're acting that out in terms of what they choose to make political events that they believe they can organize around, what they do not seem to make political events where they can organize around. So he gives the proof for his internalization thesis doing a study of public support recipients, quote-unquote welfare recipients in Chicago, where they basically say they support a more radical politics, and he does interviews with them, but they actually don't contest for like more public benefits. They do things like critique the unions for excluding them, and they do things like critique bureaucracy and things like that, even though they, in theory, support more public investment. And they continue to conclude that the distinction between the uprising for Freddie Gray and the lack of an uprising for Corinne Gaines, a Black woman who was killed in Baltimore County by Baltimore County Police, is an example of internalizing invisible weapons because of the fact that Corinne was armed. She was, in their words, a resistant person, and therefore the death of Freddie was grievable in addition to patriarchy, while Corinne's was not in the same way. The one example she gives is a protest at the National FOP meeting in Baltimore led by some members of BYP 100 and some local organizers. So I thought this was just a very important book that I'd seen cited very favorably by some people that we should comment on, because I have about 3 or 4 points I want to get to. First is the level of specific rigor around Baltimore is very low. Just reading Dr. Johnson's book has actually made me desirous of a more in-depth interrogation of analysis. For example, the author says that Gilmore Homes has been demolished. As Dr. Johnson reports, there were conversations about demolishing Gilmore Homes and demolishing some parts of it, but it's not demolished. In this book was out as of 2022, so they had the ability to know that. Similarly, the book says that there are prospects for reform, but none of them, policing reform, but none of them look promising. And as of 2021, we passed legislation to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which they know is a thing that exists, but they don't talk at all about reform movements addressing those. So those are just some larger examples, but I think a more specific example is just this distinction between the Baltimore County and Baltimore City, which they note, but they mention, like, they don't give an example of why distinction in organizing may have been knowing the Baltimore County legislature and knowing the state's attorney, Scott Schellenberger, is hardcore conservative. There was basically no possibility of a conviction at a local level, and that organizing shifted in many ways to a state level against the LEOBR. There's no conception of that being the event. It is just a lack of overt protest against the FOP, and really why their friends in organizing formations were not supported more vocally when they protested the national FOP, as opposed to us here in Maryland fighting the local FOP and the assorted Democrats and unions that were supporting the local FOP. So this conception of what counts as an event and not an event, I think really denigrates the entirety of Black grassroots and political organizing from 2015 to 2022. Mm-hmm. All the political advancements, bail reform, felon reenfranchisement, many of these fights led by Black women. But he internalizes this notion of patriarchy, the fact that people didn't protest for Corinne the way they did for Freddie, as internalizing the invisible weapon of patriarchy. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just an incredible misread of the successes and realities that were actually happening on the ground, but they can make sense from an abstract academic perspective.
Yeah, I mean, one thing in my reading of some of that was astounding that this was not mentioned at all is that if we are honest about social movements and the way that those social movements impact, the way that those social movements are impacted by larger forces, there are people who sought opportunism as it relates to many of these different initiatives. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to take seriously, like, how might that impact the way that people relate to these various different efforts? And how might that have an impact on the analysis that is brought to bear? And I would say the example you gave around the distinction between Baltimore County and Baltimore City, like if you're serious about addressing the forces that make it so black people are victims of police violence, that distinction is paramount in understanding the different landscapes of organizing. Baltimore County, a lot of black folks that live in Baltimore County are people that move from Baltimore City. And they move from Baltimore City for a variety of reasons, but one of the undercurrents is we're not trying to be around them niggas no more, right? So Baltimore County, and particularly that area that she lived, is a place where the residents are more conservative because of the fact that many of them moved from Baltimore to get away from the things that is attributed or associated to black life, right? So if you're serious about dealing with those forces, then that would be a extremely important part of the analysis as to how then you make how you draw a conclusion for the kinds of movement activity that would exist in Baltimore County. Even if his argument, the author's argument, were to remain that he thought that it was an issue or the invisible weapons framework is the reason why there wasn't as big of an uprising for Corinne Gaines and Freddie Gray, you at least have to contend with that. It's just one example of a thing that you'd have, like, okay, explain to me then, given all those dynamics, then how that remains to be true. But I think the lack of that analysis, to me, just demonstrates, one, just a level of analytical unseriousness about addressing it. But going back to what I said, I think there's some movement opportunism, right? Where being able to make those kinds of arguments endear you in certain academic and so-called movement spaces, and to me, that's kind of how I read it.
Yeah. I think that one of the biggest things that made me want to talk about the text is there is a certain politics that the book is trying to present around black feminism and trying to read Corinne as a individual, resistive black feminist figure who was armed, and that explaining why people didn't mobilize for her. That obscures the fact that she saw herself as a collective part of a community called the Moorish science community. And one of the biggest things I saw in my research is that there are many in the Moorish science community that believe that Noble Drew Ali was actually killed by police. So it is a collective culture of pan-African connection that produced not only the resistance that the book is lauding to her as an individual woman, but also created the context structurally for the police encounter. Because part of what had been happening is that she had been driving around on Moorish science tags. So for those who don't know, the Moorish science community believes that they reject the citizenship of the United States. Corinne in this book is called a sovereign citizen. And again, that obscures the fact that this is part of a larger theoretical connection of Moorish science communities to the country of Morocco, the historical Moors that control parts of Spain, tied to advancements in mathematics and culture. And they not only theoretically reject the hegemony of the United States, they do things like sometimes they don't get birth certificates. Sometimes they reject carrying identification papers. Critically, they oftentimes go through their own internal car registration services and don't have legal state of Maryland tags on their cars, which created some of the context of the tickets that led to the police encounter. So not only do you obscure the Pan-African culture, communal rebelliousness in the specific story of Noble Drew Ali as a potential victim of police brutality, but you obscure the structural dynamics that people in the Moorish science community are still dealing with today. I literally just got a call a couple weeks ago for someone from the Moorish science community having trouble getting their car back from police because they don't have the proper paperwork. And this idea of we didn't mobilize for her because she was a black woman with a gun obscures the fact that there are entire communities of black nationalists mobilizing all the time that many of the people in the movement for Black Lives, who they're trying to lift up, have actually been very critical of, and obscures the ability for the Pan-African and black nationalist political movement that she was actually part of to be seen as part of the solution. It's just rendered to a position of unsought. And especially when the text ties her story, her mother apparently had gone on stage with Kimberly Crenshaw. of course, one of the founders of intersectionality, but it's tied to versions of intersectionality recently that supported things like Hillary Clinton and Hillary Clinton's invasion of Libya. And I don't think Corinne would have supported that. But these are the sort of just extreme political lacunas, and maybe that explains more why so-called Black Lives Matter didn't truly resonate with the masses than this internalization of the invisible weapons of patriarchy and neoliberalism.
Yeah, I mean, even, quickly, even like, so my barber, Conscious Heads, Jabari Natour, who's, been around, real typical in terms of like doing lectures with major Black nationalist figures and pan-Africanist figures, your Barimba Anis and your Dr. Welsings and your John Henrik Clarks and your Khaled Muhammad's, over the years. He's in the barbershop, has a frame of her obituary in the barbershop, right? Mm-hmm. Not Freddie Gray, right? But he has a frame of Corinne Gaines of her obituary in the barbershop. And so again, to say that, I would argue that in fact the most radical of the masses were supportive of pushing back against what happened to Corinne Gaines, whereas it was actually more the mainstream, right? It was safer to deal with Freddie Gray, but and so in some ways, I think it might even make the opposite argument that the author's making.
Yeah, and of course the mobilization around Breonna Taylor in many ways challenges this idea that Black women's deaths aren't grievable. But again, like they even conceded, yes, objectively more Black men are killed by police, as folks like Tommy Curry point out, but still sees the inability to mobilize a brown Black woman as, again, almost like blaming the victims. That, again, like, I know they're trying to say these were, in our term parlance, injected oppressions, but it still seems to reflect a politics of centering on the pathology of the victim, as opposed to looking at the agency that we've demonstrated through things like repealing the LEOBR, or again, just like the autonomous work of folks like Rashid Aziz or folks in the Moorish science community to build businesses, that maybe people on the ground in the grassroots see that as a more direct reflection of their vision of meeting their material needs. Not that they don't know that capitalism is limited, not that they don't know that they deserve public assistance, but they know, given white supremacy, they're unlikely to be successful advocating for a Green New Deal to employ everybody or universal basic income. Like, they know that's not going to come in until the long term. So as opposed to viewing it as them internalizing invisible weapons, the communal connection towards politics addressing their material needs in ways they can control, as they heard from the people they interviewed in Chicago, as opposed to taking that seriously as an intelligent, intentional political decision. They just say, no, basically the people have internalized false consciousness, as Marx would say, or internalized neoliberalism and are victims of invisible weapons, as opposed to agents of a politics that's inconvenient for the preconceived political conclusions you want to come to.
I want to put a finer point on something that both of us have mentioned in this conversation in the respective texts that we've looked at, which is the way how people with a political perspective or agenda approach the perspectives of the masses of Black people in the grassroots and Black civic life. Because I think one of the things in reading the book you sent me and in reading Cedric Johnson's book, one of the things that is extremely frustrating is the way that working class Black people, even though these are the people that both these texts are saying they're championing, that their argument seems to be denigrating the agency and intelligence of working class Black people in a way that to me it raises the question of, what is it? Like what I have said in this conversation in other contexts is these are Black folks who themselves have strained connections to the masses of working class Black people that do not fit a certain intellectual academic orthodoxy that makes the respective authors feel comfortable or feel rooted and grounded. Now that's my projecting based on my analysis of their analysis. But it is such a for me, a consistent dynamic, even though both these books have different ideological jumping off points, right? As I mentioned, Cedric Johnson's book is critical of the networks that the author that you're referring, the book that you're talking about, Johnson's critical of those folks. So these are folks that have two different ideological jumping off points, but have the same fundamental kind of patronizing, maybe in even some ways dehumanizing perspective on working class black people, where it seems like the thinking is, how do we get these working class black people to actually be smart enough to adopt a politics that will be good for them? And so, what do you think about? Because I think that's one of the overlapping themes of kind of both of these texts.
Yeah, I think especially this text, you could feel a degree of emotion where it really comes from this person, I believe, went to school in Baltimore County. And I just think that the idea of seeing what happened to Corinne, so for example, she was live streaming the police situation on Facebook. Facebook cut her feed and police shot her and her baby, right? And that is so emotionally devastating. It's like, how could we not riot? How could we not protest? What's wrong with you people, right? And I think that there's a community of people that will validate that perception and give you professional advancement based upon producing a politics based upon that perception. And it is more politically, intellectually difficult and even professionally difficult to have the integrity to actually study people in their reality. Because again, it's not like the book, it doesn't have huge like data errors or anything like that. It's not like these things aren't real. But it's also like, to have a vision of these things being true, it means the amount of you being in the academy and being on podcasts and talking about this is no longer sufficient. You actually have to do the very difficult political work of knowing who Scott Schellenberger is, knowing his relationship to Fox 45, trying to go into places like Conscious Heads where they may be like, who are you? We'll look at you crazy. It's emotionally and psychologically difficult, where it's opposed to going to conferences and you get your pain affirmed and you have potential professional advancements, at least before the woke clash happened, and maybe that's coming. The backlash to the woke stuff, that made it feel like your pain was not just legitimate, but the center of explaining why the world is what it is. And it can be an intoxicating illusion to be like, I'm so right, people can't even see how right I am. Mm-hmm. And almost you get to flatter yourself. Mm-hmm. And you also get to explain the masses not engaging your political theory as this almost condescending noblesse oblige, where it's like, I understand I've been privileged, I've had educational experiences, so they can't see what I see. Mm. And as opposed to being like, maybe they see something different. Maybe they do see what you see and have come to a different conclusion. It's like, no, because they don't use the right words. They don't cite the right people. They can't see what I see. It's like, no. They know what happened to Corinne Gaines, which is why they went to Annapolis. They just didn't march in the streets in a way that made an event that reflected your politics and your real catharsis. They didn't back up your friends. Mm-hmm. We didn't back up your friends. Because that's part of it, again, this is somewhat personal because we were there. Mm-hmm. And it's like we were dealing with the Democrats and the local FOP. A national FOP thing was important. But that wasn't going to be the center of our politics because we need to make stuff move locally. And that's how we honor her. Mm-hmm. That's not a diss to her. It's the opposite. Mm-hmm. So to have somebody not enmeshed in the culture and context of the community basically claim that we disrespected Corinne Gaines after we did all this political advocacy and like a whole 2-hour-long podcast explicitly about her, using her poetry in the podcast. Again, maybe that explains why people don't resonate with you all more than the invisible weapons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and, what I'll add to that is that I think there is a deep psychosocial dynamic when it comes to Black people and our relationship to our broader community. And one of the things that Johnson, when he talked in the quote that you read, where he talks about, the politics of Black authenticity. And as I mentioned before, like, we don't use that term. Like, we don't see ourselves as more authentically Black than other people, although there are people who project it onto us. For us, it's a question of making yourself available politically, intellectually, socially to the masses of Black people in the community to engage them in a way that demonstrates respect for the fact that people have already been thinking about a lot of these questions, and not assuming that folks have not thought about it, or that the folks who've thought about it have merely just been pushed out as a result of neoliberal politics. So, with Johnson and the way that he describes like the black grassroots and the way that it's tricked by neoliberal politics and black officials to embrace neoliberal politics, it's an insult to, fight blight. You know what I'm saying? Who's trying to deal with blight in Baltimore from this black nationalist perspective that not at all is capitulating to, the corporate mainstream, right? Like, it's a disrespect to the Bloom Collective that's looking at black maternal health, right, from a perspective, working class that's often fighting against those neoliberal forces in the medical system, right, who want more mainstream hospital-centric approaches to maternal health. Like, it is a disrespect to the fact that there are people in community, the people in the state who are formerly incarcerated, right, who are active and engaged in the work of reentry and voting rights for people that are formerly incarcerated, and involved in what you mentioned around the violence prevention space. Like, alternative, when we talk about abolition, there's a network of black folks that are formerly incarcerated, connected to people formerly incarcerated, that have been the basis for driving down violence in Baltimore. And so there's a way that I think Johnson in this book and the book that you're referencing, what is clear is a lack of substantive engagement with the work and ideas that black folks in the grassroots have already been thinking of. And that if you took working class black people serious, you would come to the subject of Baltimore and you would ask, you would inquire, what are some of the major bodies of work that have been produced that would help analyze what folks in the black grassroots are thinking about and engage that. And I think in neither text, there is a real engagement with the ideas and work that black grassroots folks have been engaged in.
Yeah, the most sympathetic thing to conclude, I would say, is, Dr. Cleo Monago calls it the white supremacy trauma trance. And I think we're seeing two slightly different versions of that. So I've heard people on the racial capitalism, black folks through the lens of racial capitalism, be like, we didn't see globalization coming. And almost like it being emotional, like they failed almost. That was a failing. And that's just traumatizing. And I think similarly in the academy, you feel like a victim as a black person. Like, those spaces are incredibly psychologically violent. And it's like, well, if I feel this way, then those poor folk have to be even more victims, even more powerless, even more down bad, more victims. So it's a reflection of your own trauma to be unable to see the possibilities of agency in institutions being produced by people because you're stuck in your own experience of trauma, to see the possibility of them doing politics that isn't just epiphenomenal or an extension of the larger, more institutions of violence that are traumatizing you. We hope you enjoyed that conversation between myself, Lawrence Grandpre, and LBS Director of Public Policy, Dayvon Love, around the academic analysis of the 10-year anniversary of the Baltimore Uprising. In Baltimore, we have a very rich history of resistance and building institutions that is not always cataloged in academic depictions of Baltimore. That includes things like Perrin Mitchell and his use of minority set-asides in a way that challenges Cedric Johnson's simplistic conception of them as an extension of neoliberal capitalism. It's a way of employing working-class black people and improving the conditions for the masses. In many ways, we theorize that as a potential framework of economic redistribution, as opposed to simplistic neoliberal co-option. Similarly, Walter Carter and his control of the community action agencies, so-called poverty programs, is in many ways seen as a template and epitome of bottom-up community control that inspired the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund and the work we're doing with the Reparations Commission, advancing reparations for war on drugs through the tax revenue from legal cannabis sales. These are the sorts of stories depicted in the Baltimore Legacy Project. So this is an ongoing documentary project taking videos of many figures in Baltimore history, current, past, and hopefully future, The person leaving this will be familiar to some of you. This is Rashim, one of the former co-hosts here at In Search of Black Power. She is continuing her work through the production of a variety of documentaries, one of which is slated to be released in April 2025, is around the Baltimore Uprising. So if you sign up for our email communications at lbsbaltimore.com, you'll be able to get more in-depth access to the Baltimore Legacy Project. The idea is to have a showing in person in Baltimore for the 10-year anniversary of the Baltimore Uprising, but additionally, to have these materials online. And this is not conceptualized as one documentary. It is a series of documentaries which will hopefully cover a variety of subjects that are not only familiar to longtime listeners of In Search of Black Power, including hopefully Perrin Mitchell and Walter Carter, but also using Baltimore as a template to give analysis that will be useful for people trying to do work all over the country. And this is work that we seek to support as leaders of a beautiful struggle. And our ability to support it is contingent upon the support we get from you all. So this is the sort of intercommunal investment between Black institutions that allows for the production of knowledge and the advancement of politics outside of the academy, outside of the academic gaze, outside of what the academic gaze believes is possible. And that's powered by folks like you. So you can support the Baltimore Legacy Project directly. Just Google Baltimore Legacy Project. It should take you to that GoFundMe page. But additionally, we as an organization have made an institutional investment in things like the Baltimore Legacy Project because we believe in the possibility of telling our own stories. And we believe it's necessary to counter the academic obfuscation, if you allow me to use a big word, the academic attacks, the academic inability to conceptualize the complexity and reality of what's actually happening on the ground in places like Baltimore. So if you believe that that sort of analysis is important, if you believe that the work we do advancing a political agenda here in Baltimore and Maryland is valuable, we ask you to continue to support us by becoming a Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle sustainer. Go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. Your investment of anywhere from $10 to $50 a month allows us to do things like invest in Baltimore Legacy Project, allows us to do the legislative advocacy in places like Annapolis that produce the results that we were able to represent into the academic canon here on this episode. And it's really more important now than ever. So we're heading into another Trump administration. Many people are going to be saying, well, Republicans have all three branches of government. We have to look at the state and local level. Fortunately, we've been looking at state and local level since our inception 15 years ago. So in many ways, we have a 15-year head start on this moment. So rather than seeing Baltimore as a reservoir of decay, a reservoir of chaos, as Cedric Johnson cites David Harvey, a white academic geographer, in his analysis of Baltimore as a mess, and not a good mess, but a bad mess. We see that chaos as opportunity for us to inject our political theory into that chaos and make order out of it in a way that reflects the community's desires and community's needs. So please continue to support us at lbsbaltimore.com. If you can't give monetarily, please sign up for our email listserv. We continue to give updates about our work in the Maryland General Assembly, and especially going into the summer, we're going to be talking more about the local work we're doing here in Baltimore under the Reparations Commission, around doing things like trying to influence the nearly $500 million opioid settlement that Baltimore City has. All this is work that we can do outside of needing to get direct foundation support for our advocacy, because we have a cushion of financial support that comes from the money folks like you give us every month. So please continue to check us out on lbsbaltimore.com. Check us out on all social media. Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle or LBS Baltimore should get you what you need. Please continue to support Black liberation media as we continue as a collective and as a formation in this 10 years, both a very short time and a very, 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 very long time since the death of Freddie Gray. And as of August 1st, it'll be coming up on 9 years since the passing of Corinne Gaines. We continue to go in search of Black Power. Please go back in our catalog, actually, and look up the episode that myself and now Poet Laureate of the state of Maryland, another victory, Lady Breon, the episode we did on Corinne Gaines. Put a lot of work into that, including trying to honor her with bringing some of her poetry into the podcast and interrogating the more science perspective of her life and unfortunate deaths in more detail. So again, we thank you, and we hope you continue to walk with us as we continue to go in search of Black power. See you soon.